Of all the genres of video games to exist, Metroidvanias are the one that I feel like has seen, comparatively, the biggest resurgence in recent years. Notable is the fact that many of the most well-known and popular releases of this type aren't even made by AAA developers. Many are created by indie teams, some of which are surprisingly small. We all know about Hollow Knight, which is not only a legend of its time, but undoubtedly going to remain a classic staple in the genre and video games as a whole. In the ranks alongside Hollow Knight are also titles like Guacamelee, Axiom Verge, Shovel Knight, the recent Ender Lilies, all examples which I don't have footage for, and countless others that I'm surely forgetting, not to mention some that I've likely not even heard of yet. But in a genre as diverse as this, sometimes it's a little bit difficult for titles to stand on their own and separate themselves from the rest. Introducing new mechanics and world-building ideas that other games haven't already incorporated before can certainly be a challenge. But there's one game in particular, released in 2021, that I believe not only takes some of the best elements of the genre and incorporates them in ways that feel dynamically tailored to the game's structure, but also adds new mechanics, or depending on how you see it, puts emphasis on other types of mechanics that are unique and make the gameplay loop of this title distinct from the ones we've seen before it. Add to all that some incorporated foundational similarities to the most overly referenced game in reviews, and an art/visual design and style that alone separates the title from its competition, and you come out with Grime, a game that contends heavily for the #1 spot in my personal 2021 Game of the Year list. So close in fact that it's tied with Little Nightmares 2 for top honors. I don't remember exactly how it was that I first encountered this game. I believe it was at some point during one of Steam's indie showcase events sometime last year, but I can't be too certain. All I know is that as little as a few seconds of footage was enough to garner my full attention. Looking at a playable figure with a black hole for a head and an art design such as this was not something that was going to pass my interest. As soon as I knew the title of the game, I went and purchased it, for only $20 on sale at the time, and only $25 regular if my memory stands to scrutiny. The title wasn't asking for much. It was a low bargain for what I had encountered in gameplay footage. As you have no doubt picked up on by now, the game and its marketing clicked perfectly for me. All of this took place sometime in the summer of 2021, sometime soon after the game launched in 1.0. However, I didn't actually get around to playing the game for myself despite hovering my cursor over it dozens of times in the months prior, until right around Christmas time 2021. When I was at last free from the grips of the ever-living hell that is college for the holidays, and actually had a long weekend off from work, I finally took the plunge and launched the game, and I was met with something even more glorious than I had hoped I would. You are the Chiseled One, born in the corner of a mysterious world. A world where beauty and proportion are primary factors in your worth. Your proportions are perfect, and your being an image of importance. To most, you are a selfish and callous being. Jealous, they try to make an effort to keep you away from the ultimate end goal of decay and absorption of the world they know. But to others, many in the upper echelon of the world, worship you as a god, chosen above the rest to be the consumer of landscapes, the hand-picked orator of destruction, a being of will and destiny. The world you are dropped in is cavernous and cold. You begin to slowly and methodically make your way through the unfamiliar and disorienting passages of the Weeping Cavity. Along the way, you encounter a friendly boulderhead named Yon, who quickly becomes entranced by your beauty, and who recruits himself to your aid, giving you encouragement as you continue to make your way through the caverns, and lending you your first physical weapon. At the end of the winding road, you come across a large foe called Amalgam, which blocks your way to reaching the wide open world outside called the Unformed Desert, where pieces of carven rock and stone fall from the sky. From here, you can tell how the world wants to begin opening up. But for now, you must continue on your journey by going straight to Lithic and finding your way through there. But you can take a sneak peek into Gloomnest from the Unformed Desert and witness all of the darkness, dinginess, and discomfort that comes with it. But before you can do much there, you journey all around Lithic and a few patches of community within it until you come across the Whispering Mothers, whom you must defeat to move on, ultimately destroying parts of Lithic in the process. Once you've done this, the path leads you to the World Pillar, which you reach by flying over top Neverroot. You meet Shidra in the World Pillar, who tasks you with obtaining the Killia Stone before you continue further to the east into the Feaster's Lair below Gloomnest. From this point, your path takes you through Neverroot, heading to the left, and you watch as the map grows ever more complex and scales up tremendously from here. In the Feaster's Lair, you meet the Vulture, who drops the Killia Stone and grants you an ability that opens up nearly the rest of these western regions of the map. Add to that the option to move further east on the Servant's Path and into the Carven Palace after you give Shidra the Killia Stone, and it's here when you realize that the land is now nearly free reign to you. The way that the map unfolds and the fact that it takes a not insignificant amount of time to truly become accessible was a design choice made in Grime that surprised me a little bit. I may not have much experience with Metroidvanias generally speaking, my main experience in the genre being with Hollow Knight, which opens up very quickly, suddenly, and almost overwhelmingly when you take into account how large virtually every area is. It was definitely a change of pace to come to Grime and have it take its time, with a somewhat more relaxed pacing. I do feel like I should clarify a little bit of what I mean though. One of the most well-regarded parts of Hollow Knight, and probably the thing I respect most about it, is how intricately connected everything within Hallownest is. It often blows my mind just how many different areas there are in that game, how they flow so seamlessly and how accessible most of them are as early as they become so, despite the tight route required to reach them in the first few hours. The speed at which you acquire tools and movement abilities in Hollow Knight may not be the quickest out of every game like it, but considering that a single playthrough of the game can relatively easily clock out at over 100 hours, depending on how much exploring you do and how lost you get, in the grand scheme of things it is actually pretty fast. If you happen to be going in the right direction early on for the most part, it's not too difficult to blaze your way through it. But note a key phrase in this paragraph: if you happen to be going in the right direction early on. The detail in how the dense map fits together may be one of the best things about Hollow Knight, but for some players, it's also one of the worst from a gameplay perspective. Most people love that vaguely haunting feeling of being lost while exploring a world. Those who feel this way are typically right at home in Hallownest, because when a map is this big and each area is this deeply integrated with the rest as you journey through it, it's very, very easy to go the wrong direction and be spending hours meandering around, unsure if you're going the right way. While many Metroidvanias rely on this, they make a point of purposely leading you to dead ends and junctions that require new abilities to pass, so that those places will memory hole their way into your subconscious as you explore elsewhere. It's a pretty genius tactic, and one that Hollow Knight admittedly uses spectacularly, especially considering the sheer size of Hallownest and the secrets hidden within it. Grime plays completely different in this way. My summary earlier told you of just how long you're questing through a pretty linear experience for perhaps the first 15% or so of the game, possibly more. Rather than everything opening at once and overwhelming you, it unravels bit by bit, with that pace somewhat increasing as you move along. The game is a pretty brief 20 hours or less, depending on how insistent you are on uncovering 100% of the map and collecting every item. My first playthrough, when I did everything and without knowing anything about the map, maxed at just over 20 hours, so I suspect most players can get through it in about 15 or so. But despite how small it is, at least in comparison to Hollow Knight, which is admittedly a pretty unfair comparison to make in terms of size, you actually don't get your vessel's first movement ability until the final few hours of the game. In the hours from the beginning till the end, there's a decently large gap in between each of your major upgrades. For me, Grime's world layout and map design felt no less intricate and purposeful than that of Hollow Knight or other competitors, specifically because of this design philosophy. All things considered, Grime is a pretty linear game. Once you get the Killia Stone for Shidra, you can head straight to the Carven Palace, which is huge and the only confusing area of the game in terms of its layout. Get to the top and fight the shapely Fidus, you gain the self-pull ability that'll let you reach the gardens for the Strand of the Child, which you will also give to Shidra. After doing all of this is when you can finally go straight beyond the barrier, which is an area of the game further to the east beyond the Carven Palace. From here to the final boss and the ending is the most linear part of the game. Although there is still lots of world to explore before going beyond the barrier, you technically don't need to do most of it. It's rather freeing to know this, but I'd be surprised if anybody didn't have the inkling desire to dig deeper through the rest of the game before doing so. I know I did, and that isn't just because I'm a natural-born completionist. The world looks so good and the game plays so well, it's hard to not make it an excuse to just play more of it. The only caveat to this, as far as I know, is the fact that out of the last 4 areas of the game, 3 of them are heavily platforming focused to an extent not seen really anywhere else in the game. However, to be fair, it's nowhere near as difficult as even some of the mid-tier platforming in Hollow Knight. I didn't have any problems with it, and the rest of the game outside of the Carven Palace and the Garden focus on platforming as secondary at best to the rest of the gameplay. If you've explored all of the Carven Palace and Garden, these 3 or 4 endgame levels that require a lot of platforming will pose little to no issue for you. They'll just need a bit of focus. There aren't any crazy enemies to bother you in those levels either, so you shouldn't need to stress too much, and they aren't super long. But if it's the combat you enjoy the most, there's always another weapon lurking right around the next corner looking to grab your attention if you do choose to explore the optional areas. I'm usually not a picky guy when it comes to gameplay. I don't require deep combat mechanics or systems that require a lot of time to understand or get used to. In fact, usually I err on the side of believing that many of the more simple combat systems are better because I prefer to pay attention to the story or exploration in the game. Once I find a class or weapon or playstyle that I enjoy, I don't really deviate from that in most cases, even if most games centered around their combat get more enjoyable as you dig deeper into the options available to you and develop a truly unique playstyle. As a result, I don't have a whole lot of experience with about 90% or more of the weapons in this game. It's a shame, but I have seen a little bit of gameplay with some of the various weapons that I didn't try for myself, and based on descriptions, I believe there's a little bit more depth to this area of the gameplay than I initially believed in my first playthrough. Grime has what the website describes as living weapons, tools that are made from living creatures that mutate form during combat, upgradable via blood metal splinters, shards, and chunks. Each armament has 2 to 3 unique attacks, a light attack for moderate damage and a heavy attack for higher damage that pertains to all weapons, but there are also a few particular armaments with special attacks that come from holding the heavy attack button. The roster of weapons is surprisingly impressive though. As you explore the world, you come to find more and more with every hour, not to mention the ones that you can purchase from your occasional vendor. The first weapon you come across in gameplay is the maul axe, but the ones you come across or purchase after that are yours to choose between. The only thing I really wish is, if in the moment that you acquire the maul axe from Yawn in the Weeping Cavity, he gave you an option between maybe 3 starting weapons, based on your interest in your playstyle. To be fair, the Weeping Cavity does contain the Twin Fangs and Bellow Mace for this purpose, both of which are very easy to come across, and from a world building perspective, this actually makes more sense than Yawn offering 3 different weapon types, so I guess it's just a matter of opinion. But over the course of my time with Grime, I primarily focused on dexterity-based builds. In my first playthrough, I used the 3 first weapons I got for nearly the entire time. The Maul Axe remained my baseline, heavy weapon for bigger damage against bosses, even though it doesn't come even close to what some of the strength-based weapons can do. The Twin Fangs and Fingerblade interchanged throughout as my primary tool for exploring the world though. I did use a 4th weapon, the Nail Scythe, against the final boss, or maybe the final 2 bosses, as well as for cleanup to gather all remaining items and get 100 map completion. So that's only 3 or 4 main weapons that I used in that first playthrough. In my second playthrough, I again kept the Maul Axe handy as backup, leveled up Dex a lot to try out the Chisel Nails, which are really similar to the Twin Fangs, but decided I wanted more variety. I respect and instead alternated between the Urglaive and Rawblade for my playthrough, the latter of which is actually rather similar to the Fingerblade, so I guess my desire for variety wasn't too successful. Either way, I only ended up using about 6 or 7 different weapons for any prolonged period of time, out of around 30 total offerings. Even when some scale similar to others, the special attacks and abilities are enough to make each one worth trying out, and given upcoming DLC and even more weapons to come with it, I'm absolutely going to be doing a 3rd playthrough with the purpose of trying out more of these as my primary focus. But you know what I really liked collecting though? Armor. When you take control of the vessel at the start of the game, you don't have any armor. But as you journey throughout the lands, it isn't that hard to find pieces to various different sets. Sometimes you'll find all 3 pieces for a set right next to each other, sometimes they'll all be dropped in different sections of a level that require relatively thorough explanation and platforming to acquire, and sometimes you have to purchase them from vendors. Most of them with mass, the game's currency, but one particular set in Lithic must be purchased with relics found throughout. I believe this set was my first, although I could be remembering incorrectly. I found the collection of armor to be a lot more compelling than the weapons, personally. As I mentioned earlier, I tend to stick to a fairly generic playstyle from the very beginning of my time with any game, so weapon collecting wasn't my jam in Grime. But the way that armor worked satisfied me much more. As you explore the world, you will come across particularly tough enemies called elite enemies. These enemies don't respawn when you die or enter level them surrogates, and they grant you hunt points. You can also get hunt points by finding Crimson Ichor items hidden around the world and crushing them. But these hunt points are used, while in surrogates, to upgrade the vessel with abilities gained through absorbing enemies. More on that in a bit. The reason I found armor collecting to be compelling in the game is because of the way armor sets interact with these upgrades purchased from hunt points. If my count was correct, there are around 20 armor sets in the game, and almost every one of these sets has unique perks. Some will increase your health and force, the game's version of endurance, by a given percentage, some will increase your strength, dexterity, and or resonance stats by a given percentage, and others will do some combination with mixed and matched stat bonuses. But the other thing that armor sets in Grime provides are full set bonuses, where wearing all 3 pieces of any given set will provide a similar bonus as the stat increases, but instead applied to 1 or occasionally 2 specific upgrades acquired and leveled with hunt points. What's funny is that I'm pretty sure I actually ended up wearing the same endgame armor set in the final hours of both of my playthroughs because of the way that I liked to play, but there's plenty of variety when you consider just how many of these upgrade options there are. Additionally, all of the armor sets have their own visual appeal as well, and thankfully you don't have to sacrifice your fashion for your playstyle. Your vessel allows for you to suit up in a pair of armor for its bonuses and perks, but you can apply a second armor set over top according to how you most prefer to look. Whether you want to look snazzy in an entirely different set, or mix and match for an individual unique flair, I appreciated this, just as I always appreciate transmog systems in games where you are actively looking at your character the whole time. But overall, I believe that the weapon and armor options in this game are wide-reaching and open for any player to develop into their unique vessel. And once you combine that with the upgrades mentioned earlier, there's a lot of depth to Grime that I didn't appreciate as much the first time through. And before I go any further, let's finally discuss the headline game mechanic I've somehow mostly managed to avoid for over 3,000 words. Nearly every combat game on the market has some version of a parry, whether that be a shield deflect, a well-timed bullet shot, or sometimes matching an enemy's attack with an attack of your own to counter it. There's some variety to the flashiness and the utilities of the parry. Perhaps the coolest thing about Grime is the way it leans into this mechanic. To a certain extent, the parry mechanic of Grime, called absorbing, is the primary gameplay mechanic that sets the title apart not just from other Metroidvanias, but from virtually every other combat game that I've ever seen up to this point. Recall that your vessel is a literal black hole, so instead of using a shield or similar to deflect attacks, you can use the absorb mechanic to, well, destroy and suck up enemies, or at least significantly damage more powerful enemies. Even enemies with sections of their health bar that can't be absorbed can still be deflected with this mechanic, usually giving you an opportunity to attack or leaving some of them vulnerable. The importance of this mechanic is made obvious from the very beginning of the game. You don't immediately start off with a weapon, you actually spend a surprising amount of time without any melee at all. Instead, you learn how to perfect the timing and feel of absorbing with simple, low vitality foes. I thought this was ingenious, because it solidifies this mechanic as a gameplay option throughout the entire experience and not only increases variety in your arsenal of attacks, but also opens bosses and elite enemies up to significant damage. Additionally, absorbing grants you breath, the healing mechanic of the game. Obviously, breath is not granted when you deflect attacks, but when you're able to tear a chunk of health from your opposition, you are rewarded with breath. This makes the tutorial of learning how to use the absorb mechanic very fair and reasonable, since you're automatically refilling your healing that you may have to use after missing the timing once or twice. I loved how I would adapt my fight patterns based on the health bars of bosses, and especially elite enemies based on how much opportunity, if any, they granted for acquiring breath if I needed some extra. And in case you thought that was all, the tutorial in Weeping Cavity is filled with several unique enemies that each grant their own upgrades. I briefly mentioned this in the last section, but when you absorb enemies, you aren't just severely damaging or ridding the world of their existence, granting yourself breath, and incorporating a specific element into your playstyle regardless of which class you choose to play. Absorbing your enemies also has another huge gameplay benefit. Nearly every basic mob type has the ability to be absorbed for the purpose of acquiring new upgrades. Once you absorb your first of any particular prey, you'll see an entry in your codex and a thumbnail on the screen that shows the new prey type alongside a number. That number signifies how many of that prey you must absorb to learn their upgrade. You also come to realize that a fairly sizable portion of the upgrades you earn this way are related to what the enemy did, such as this slow-moving crawler enemy that gives you the ability to walk slowly, an ability required to earn a few items and unlock 100 map exploration. It is very clear from the onset that the absorb mechanic is the central pillar to nearly all of the gameplay systems. There are even specific upgrade paths that further encourage the usage of it, such as doing damage to enemies or regenerating portions of your force meter on deflects or absorbs, and even the ability to regain health upon successful absorb execution to coincide with breath capacity refills. It's almost as if the first question the developers asked themselves when they decided to make a new game was what it would be like if there was a black hole in a video game, or if a player could control one, and then developed everything else afterwards, branching all additional mechanics and even the NPC, enemy, and boss designs and encounters into that original concept to create a truly unified and unique experience. Surprisingly enough, it's very difficult to find a list anywhere online of all the NPCs throughout Grime, and even though I've done 2 playthroughs, I don't remember them all or their names at all. Truth be told, most don't have any true quest line like you might expect from, say, a Dark Souls game, one of this game's other influences, but that's not to say it's not nice to see a familiar face here and there throughout the world. If I'm remembering correctly, since I'm unable to corroborate with gameplay footage or anything at the time of writing and recording this video, there are a few relatively minor NPCs who you encounter and can talk to briefly while running your two main errands for Shidra. They are kind of like right-hand men to Shidra to a certain extent, but don't otherwise serve much plot purpose to my knowledge, maybe just giving a little bit of lore here and there. But most of the NPCs in this game are simply just vendors or these lanky, creepy looking fellas that hang around / guard some of the nerve passes. But when you disregard these relatively unimportant characters, there are two specific NPCs I want to briefly mention here: Goldhead and Yawn. Goldhead is a special NPC who you encounter very infrequently throughout the game, only 3 or 4 times so far as I remember, with the final appearance being in the Yurden. Each encounter features multiple lines of dialogue where lore hints are given to you. I'm not here to talk about the story because I don't understand basically any of it, but interactions with Goldhead were always super cool to me. They were vague and hinted at something deeper, and his final line always got my theory senses tingling, though I never knew what to do with them. Although it could just be a reference to the main ending of the game, I think it could possibly be a reference to him playing a role in the upcoming DLC that we don't know much about yet. I think it would be cool to see a boss fight with him or something along those lines, but we shall see. But the real special NPC to talk about though is Yawn. Yawn is the only NPC with an obvious quest line so far as I can tell. There is an achievement tied to him after all, and he plays a relatively active role in guiding you through the main path of the game, and probably gives you more background story and lore details than most other characters in the game, if not all of them, aside from, say, maybe Shidra, or possibly Goldhead, depending on how you interpret his lines. For those who haven't played the game yet, I don't want to discuss Yawn's actual questline itself because it is one of the most enjoyable parts of playing the game, but just know that it's really cool. Oh, and I suppose I should also mention Shidra as his own personal NPC, being the character you do the most for, as well as, being the one in the world pillar who upgrades all of your weapons for you, but there's something special about him that I won't spoil as well. Generally speaking, Grime's NPCs don't play the biggest role in the game, but as the world changes, seeing the reactions from some of them at time to time, and anticipating the role that some play or may play both in the main journey of the game, but also what may come in DLC, is exciting and fun to think about, even if some of them don't frequently show enough concern for you, absolutely destroying their brethren until endgame. Enemy variety is one of those things that we criticize heavily when there's none of it, don't really mention when it's neither lacking nor abundant, and praise to a pretty high degree when there's a lot of it. One of the things I personally love most about Hollow Knight, although come to think of it, I love almost everything about Hollow Knight the most, so maybe I should stop saying that, is the enemy variety. With something like over 150 unique enemy types, that title was certainly not lacking in that variety, and while some of those enemies were much more annoying to deal with than others, the sheer amount of them was amazing. We've already established that Grime may not be as extensive or interconnected as Hollow Knight, but relative to its size, I gotta say that enemy variety in Grime is done incredibly well in its own right. A feature in both Hollow Knight and Grime that I really love is how the different areas and zones interact with each other in gameplay. When you're approaching new areas in Hollow Knight, the vibe of said new area seeps over to the next. The biomes start to mingle a little bit. In this specific part of the Forgotten Crossroads, you can see the overgrowth of green path as you transition areas. Similar examples can be mentioned from where different areas of the game interact with each other throughout the entirety of the playthrough. Grime does something similar, though to a slightly smaller degree. Backgrounds and scenery change very slowly as you approach new locations in Grime, but what's particularly interesting is how the enemies, known as lesser prey, overlap between areas. Many of the basic enemies that appear close to the end of the Weeping Cavity appear in the Unfarmed Desert, most of whom can also be found in Gloomnest and or Lithic. This made my exploration in Grime's world nearly as memorable and immersive as my exploration of Hallownest. I found this to be a great design choice and idea, and in some ways, I have a much more intimate relationship with the enemies in this game than, say, in Hollow Knight. This is due partially to the way that absorbing enemies actually makes a difference in how you level up your vessel and otherwise plays several active in-the-moment roles in the gameplay. But another reason for this is that there are less mobs overall as well, and they all appear so often in their biomes that they become really familiar fights without necessarily growing to be a pain. Except for Servant's Path and Carven Palace enemies who throw these red nails. The red nails could just be removed from the game for all I care. But to get back to the main point and further it a little bit, even basic mobs appear often enough that you start to develop specific strategies to utilize against particular prey, or against a particular group of them. Every encounter feels purposeful and fresh because of how well you understand enemy patterns alongside your familiarity with the vessel and the options you have at your disposal. This feeling, for me at least, is also intensified by elite prey. I'm having trouble drawing specific examples to mind, but I feel like typically elite type enemies in games kind of get the short end of the stick. There tends to either be so few of them that they feel more like underwhelming or paper-mache mini-bosses, or so many of them that they're virtually indistinguishable from regular enemies, or even bosses to some extent. It seems like a fairly tough balance to strike, but in Grime I'd say that's nowhere near how they're treated. Elite prey firstly grant a very specific reward that set them apart from any other normal mob, even the tougher ones. Hunt points, as I mentioned several times before, are such a useful and honestly important part of the game depending on how you play, that these enemies actually matter to you. They're not just tougher versions of basic mobs, they're basically like bosses in their own right, albeit with a far more limited amount of health. Additionally, there's usually at least a few different fights with each type of elite enemy, being relatively localized to certain areas, similar to how regular mobs are localized to their biomes in the world. I don't know, there was just this thrill that I got from fighting these stronger enemies that further encouraged my exploration of the world, and they spaced out the gaps between the platforming challenges and various bosses beautifully. It's taken me a really long time to fall onto the whole bosses are cool bandwagon, or whatever you want to consider it. Although I enjoyed watching people play Souls games and the like over the years, I never started playing them until pretty recently, and it took until probably the middle of 2021 when I was playing Remnant from the Ashes that I discovered that I now look forward to boss fights just as much as I dread them. Well-designed boss fights are now highlights of gaming for me, and I've started to see games differently because of them. Even games like Need for Speed Carbon, one of my favorite games growing up and even still now, I think about differently. I never considered boss races in that kind of game to be, well, boss races, at least not consciously in my head until the last couple of years. And since I've been bringing it up repeatedly throughout the entire video so far, the bosses in Hollow Knight are not just one of the best collections of bosses in Metroidvanias, but one of the best collections of bosses in gaming as a whole. Although I don't think Grime has that same impact in its boss roster, I came to appreciate the bosses in this game far more than I had anticipated. When I look back at it, I realize that a large reason for this is because the first boss, Amalgam, is a complex boss for how early he appears, being the first one in the game. But even with that being established, I think he's a completely fair challenge. In order to defeat him, you have to learn how to be proficient with the mechanics the game spent the entirety of the Weeping Cavity prior teaching you. He forces you to use your skills in the context of a big bad, and that felt really satisfying. To me, this seemed like it was the rule with all of the bosses of the game, whether they be Epic Prey, which are Grime's mini-bosses, or Great Prey, the game's major bosses that progress you through the primary journey. Nearly every single boss, both major and minor, felt like their own wholly unique encounter that was a joy to learn and execute my understanding of, even on my second playthrough. The only bosses that I felt didn't follow this rule the same way were the 3 rock giant bosses, but even they all had slight variation in moves and aggressiveness towards you and were separated enough in gameplay that made them not feel annoying to come across multiple times. And I suppose maybe the Artisan of Flesh was not nearly as enjoyable or satisfying as his companions because it felt like a test in stamina management more than anything else, even though I had a girthy force meter at the time. And the amount of obstacles and just space takers he summons was just more annoying than anything mechanically interesting, but I digress. I mentioned with the elite prey from last section that those tougher enemies perfectly space the gaps between bosses. I believe the sentiment can also be made in context of epic prey. The elite enemies break the gaps between varying boss types and whatever they are in the world that you're exploring, but epic prey are nearly entirely all optional bosses that break the gaps between great prey if you choose to fight them, and also hand out a very useful reward. One of the tools in your arsenal is your breath capacity, or the amount of healing material you currently have at any point in time. You start the game with 1 bar of health, split into 4 sections, but each epic prey you defeat provides you with an extra section. Defeat 4 total mini-bosses throughout the world and you have a 2nd bar of breath. Defeat another 4 and you get a 3rd bar. Pretty simple, but each chunk of breath capacity is extremely useful, especially as you enter the late game and the last couple great prey. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Great Prey, the major bosses. There aren't a whole lot of them, but they are all fantastic fights, and each very important for you to move forward with the game. I talked in part 1 about how the pacing of the game is pretty relaxed compared to how short it is, due mostly to how far apart your movement upgrades are. But despite this, I felt like this worked overall for the game that Cloverbyte was trying to make. And granted, the satisfaction that I got from this, even if part of me wishes these upgrades came quicker, was because the upgrades actually come from absorbing the final pieces of your felled Great Prey. It works because it feels like your upgrades were truly earned. Amalgam grants the ability to build Ardor, a stat that, the higher it is, lets you earn more mass from killing enemies. Very useful for the early game when one of your main focuses is leveling up. The Whispering Mothers give you the Pull ability, which you can use against vulnerable enemies and also use for getting around the world. The Vulture lets you air dash, which further opens up how you move around the world and even how you encounter or avoid some enemies. The Shapely Fidus gives you a self-pull, a very handy maneuvering ability. Misbegotten Amalgam, which is far more than just a reskin by the way, he's almost an entirely new boss built upon the same concept as the original, grants the ability to pull items, which you need to obtain in order to grab some sneaky armor sets and stuff that lie around the world. And the final movement ability, the Double Jump, is granted by the Final Performance, the second to last boss, which I am refraining from showing you for the sake of letting you experience it for yourself. The Final Performance and the absolute final boss are some of my favorite gaming bosses that I experienced in 2021. The Final Performance in particular was super challenging, but really satisfying since you have to master nearly everything the game has thrown at you up to this point, and the story behind it is awesome too. Grime is almost worth playing solely for the chance to face these 2 final bosses. I even had a great time spending a couple hours after I finished the game going back and cleaning everything up, getting 100% map exploration, obtaining all of the items to my knowledge, and strangely enough, I ended off both of my playthroughs with my vessel at the exact same level. But since I don't really have much to say about the bosses themselves without continuing to ramble on without reason, I'm going to end this final part here. Man, that was a lot. I'm exhausted. At the time of writing, I obviously haven't yet gone through recording and editing this video, but I predict it'll take me 25 or more hours to get all the audio and video editing done. An absolute insane amount. Besides, I've already spent so many hours working on the script, which clocking it at 7,100 words is my longest individual review script to date, translating to the longest individual scripted review video on my channel, of course assuming you aren't counting the 2 original Little Nightmares critical analysis videos together as one. However, I'm really happy with how this script has turned out, even if it took a dozen plus hours and a whole week longer than I originally wanted. Let's hope I don't burn myself out over the next 3 weeks editing this video before it releases. In case it wasn't obvious by the length of the video and the amount of time I'm willingly spending producing a video that 1 or 2 people will watch for 1 or 2 minutes each, I loved Grime. Like I said up top, it tied with Little Nightmares 2 as my 2021 Game of the Year. It isn't just a worthy Metroidvania, It's simply a really good game. I can't wait for DLC to come out in the future so I can play it again and then go through the new content. When it comes right down to it, I highly recommend this game to any Metroidvania fan, any Souls fan, and anybody looking for a challenging but not punishing game that features countless stunning set pieces, locations, and several very memorable gameplay moments that I am surprised to say I likely won't forget. It also has the most breathtaking final frames of a game I've ever seen, but I once again can't show them right now, no matter how much I want to, in order to avoid spoilers. It's beautiful. But at long last, we come to the end of this video. I read somewhere that Yarden, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, the game director and studio director of Cloverbyte, the Israeli game studio that made Grime, once said that he wanted for Grime to be, quote, something Israeli gamers could be proud of. I'm happy to say that, at least from my perspective, that goal was completely achieved. But to me, it's not just something that Israeli gamers can be proud of, it's something that all gamers can be proud of.